Thanks, Rob. So I've been coming to this conference now since I think 2014, and I just love the community aspect we have here. Very much so like a family, as people have said. And one of the things, with that community aspect is, we talk a lot about the ICS problems that we have, and if we see them in the aspect of its fullness, it seems overwhelming. But I think the people in this room have the ability, they have the answers to a lot of our problems. And even me being up on stage, if you would have asked me 4 or 5 years ago to come up on stage and share something, I probably would have said, I don't really have anything to offer to the community. And it's because of folks in this room and things like that that have really helped shape me personally, and we have that opportunity to give back to the community as we go along. So as the slide shows, my name is Michael Hoffman. I've been in Shell 19 years. A couple of major roles in that. I started out actually as an instrumentation electrical technician at a refinery, and from then on in, I quickly learned that as I was actually up on one of those towers one stormy January afternoon, I thought, yes, there's better jobs out there. As I couldn't feel my fingers. So anyway, from then on out, I continued my journey, did some analyzer work, and then in the refinery, went to controls and automation, worked at an asset in Wyoming, where we were doing natural gas extraction, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, back to a refinery to do a ICS engineer role. And then now in my role currently as the principal ICS engineer for all downstream assets across the globe. So getting into this talk a little bit about log visibility, just a disclaimer, these are my views, these are not Shell's views. Don't expect you to read this slide, but no matter what. So here about 2 years ago, all this network visibility equipment came out, and I was like, yes, we got to get this in our plants. I mean, this is a big deal. If you would ask me as an asset owner or operator, what are my biggest concerns? They would be, I don't know what's in my environment, right? So when we put this NSM tool out in our plant, and we hooked it up to our core switch, and we went, yeah, I can see all this information. And then we started looking at this information like, whoa, what is that traffic? Because we hadn't looked. And so we were looking at this traffic, and we noticed, this was substantial traffic in our network. And of course, this was at our, L2, 5, L3 type, if you remember the Purdue model. And so looking at this over a couple days is like, don't really know what this is. And at this same time, we have a lot of OPC communication down to our DCS going on and so forth. And so come to find out, this was us doing harm to us. This was a logging tool that we had in our environment. And we were doing WMI decom polling. So every 15 minutes, our log server would go out, scan our systems in our environment. It'd pull in the logs, and so we had log visibility, but we were hurting ourselves because we didn't have visibility into our networks. So we kind of, it's a big learning curve for us and kind of an aha moment, if you will. So, also with this, we had deployed this IT technology, IT solution in our environments in multiple different plants and environments, such as upstream, offshore, unconventionals, where we have extreme limited bandwidth capabilities and so forth. So with that, it's like, it was time to take a step back, do self-reflection and think, are we doing the best approach? We've done good with some of our solutions, but were we taking the right approach to logging? And so that was, one of the things that I began to look at, in my role. So of course we, as everybody in this room knows, our systems are constrained in the ICS. I mean, that's no brand new news, if you will. So again, we have lack of available bandwidth. Many of our systems, we have 100 meg connections, and that's doing pretty good. We also have very remote locations. Our ICS networks are not within a fence line. They're not within 4 walls, a building. We have, again, well pads, offshore locations, pipelines, and so forth. So when you think about putting in an IT tool in these environments, that tool has to be able to scale to different architectures, different constraints, and so forth. We also have, of course, vendor restrictions around the software, and rightfully so. We tell vendors we want that thing to run 24/7, 365, uptime, availability, and then we go knocking on their door and say, hey, we want to run this latest and greatest, software agent on these systems. And of course, there's a little bit of pushback. And they'll say, well, that'll maybe void, warranties and contracts and all those kind of things. Also, we have an issue with trying to keep up our operating systems. Everybody knows that's a problem. Operating systems are tied to physical hardware and infrastructure. So it's very difficult to put in a tool and try to baseline it with the operating systems that you have. Again, we have deployment constraints, we have maintenance windows to work around, and so forth. So it's very difficult to put in some of these systems and so forth when you have to go reboot every host in your environment, for instance. And then we do have a lot of best practices, if you will, from a higher level perspective. We have the NIST cybersecurity framework, we have the NIST 800 standards, a lot of things that ICS CERT has put out. That's excellent material. But when you get from vendor agnostic type best practices, they're hard to find. Are there best practices out there for logging and so forth? It's kind of hard to find, if you're being vendor agnostic. So backwards here. So from that aspect, when we look at the logs in the ICS environment, for me, again, you can argue that we have SNMP can be, added to this as well. But if you think of it, I consider really two main logging types. We have syslog, and again, if you look at a lot of the endpoint devices, our PLCs or IEDs, RTUs, even analyzers, former analyzer tech, a lot of those devices, if you look into them, they have syslog capability. And if they don't, go ask your vendor to put syslog capability in there. And definitely, because we need to begin looking into those devices. And of course, network switches, we have our routers, firewalls, protocol converters, and so forth, all have syslog capability. We need to be enabling those and looking at that equipment. And then, of course, we have our NIC systems, even VMware is a part of that. But for this talk, I really want to concentrate on two different logging aspects, really. So WMI with DCOM pulling, and then also Windows Event Log forwarding. Now, we also have agent-based systems. But again, agent-based is really, that's where we begin to have problems with putting these on our vendor kit, our big DCS or SCADA systems. And I know you can argue, WMI with DCOM. You can also do WMI with Windows Remote Management, and so that's true. But for this, a lot of common deployments I've seen in the ICS use DCOM as the choice for communicating across that network. So, being very active in SANS, I'm also in the SANS STI program. And if you have any questions around the master's program, feel free to come get a hold of me today, and even I'll be here this week taking another class. Absolutely love the STI program. Within the STI program, though, you have two opportunities to do research work and to write papers. So one of them was, the first paper I wrote was essentially this talk. It was looking at a very real problem that I had in my company and wanting to look at ways that I could fix some of that problem. So throughout the course of most of this fall, winter time frame, I did a lot of research, wrote this paper, and paper is available in the SANS reading room today if you want to go check that out. So with that, the next thing I did, so I looked at those two logging methods, Windows Event Forwarding and WMI, and I wanted to test those out from an implementation and bandwidth perspective. So first of all, if you see back in those other slides, I saw a definite bandwidth problem with log pulling with WMI. But I wanted to compare these two protocols side by side in the lab. So firstly, in my company, I did have a safe location to test these out. And I wanted to test out the deployment characteristics, again, from the aspect of how would I deploy this method in an environment so I wouldn't be causing reboots. And so I wouldn't be going out and touching every endpoint out there and so forth. Centralized deployment, some of those characteristics I wanted to look at. So what I did, and of course, this is not the Purdue model. This is not IEC 62443 zones and conduits. This is a lab testing out two protocols side by side. So that's all this represents. I also was able to use a network security monitoring tool to capture the traffic going across the core switch from the same server that was doing WMI polling and also Windows Event Forwarding, collecting. So with that, I had, I used 40 of the same components in doing each polling method. Due to some of the way the VMware system and so forth was set up, on how some of the hosts were monitoring, that NSM product did have visibility to 32 out of the 40 hosts. And for the research work that I was doing, that was plenty of traffic, and as you'll see, more than enough traffic to do some statistical analysis on it. So with that, moving forward, one of the things I wanted to do, though, in this test was set up a common logging methodology and essentially establish a baseline of the logs collected across that environment. So, of course, I leveraged some of the best practices from the SANS 410 course that Justin talks about. And from that, so that gives you a good baseline for the base logging settings in Windows. But also, those will generate quite a few logs, if you will, in your environment. But I wanted to really push my system quite a bit, almost to the DOS mode, not quite. But so if you do a little bit of research, the Australian Cybersecurity Center has done a lot of excellent research around log settings and so forth, and they've actually come up with a lot of best practices. I'd be very careful, though, how you would set these up in an ICS environment, because you can, you can bring your systems down almost with turning logging up so high. So with that, though, I pushed down a log GPO across the environment to establish that log baseline to start the research process up. And again, you can look at my white paper. I actually have listed the GPO I used in this test. So with that, I would say, and my daughter put this you drink from the fire hose image together for me a couple hours before I submitted this, so kudos to her. But anyway, who's taking SANS training this week? First of all, show hands. Awesome. You will be drinking from the fire hose in those settings. You will see just a ton of material thrown at you, 700 to 1,000 pages over the course of the next couple days of material, and it feels overwhelmingly awesome. You'll be exhausted, but you can recover. When we crank up logging settings, though, in our environment so high, to almost a debug mode, our systems don't recover from drinking from the fire hose when we push our logs out to our SIM. So one of the things in my research I found was that Don Murdoch, and he is also one who's been through the STI program. He now has a GSC certification. But he wrote this book, the Blue Team Handbook. And it's one I'd really, really recommend that folks from a defense standpoint would actually use. And not, and again, he's more IT bent, but this is all things defense. And so if you want to really look at use cases from that your SOC team uses and correlate that down to actually Windows Event IDs, Don has done an exceptional job at that. So I completely recommend that you pick up his book, support his efforts in really giving back to the community. Just an excellent resource. So he does go into, Don does go into a lot of areas where you can do that correlation between use cases and events. And then also there's just a lot of generic best practices in there from a blue team perspective. So with that, of course, when I set up the infrastructure for WMI polling, of course, if you're not familiar with it, WMI is client-server architecture and so forth. And I do want to step back a little bit. In a lot of this discussion, it seems like I'm beating up on WMI quite a bit, and I'm trying not to. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is, maybe we're using the wrong tool, and you'll understand more about that in a second. But of course, it's client-server. The mechanism again is DCOM over the wire. So the server pulls the logs. It goes in request logs with the DCOM. And then the logs get pulled back. So anyway, so you have this constant pull, essentially a request for logs out in the environment. The endpoints will give you logs if they have them. So if you're requesting logs all the time, so let's say you want to turn up your resolution, so that your WMI log polling server will essentially be contacting all those endpoints at whatever frequency you set to get those logs back in your environment. And again, ultimately, to get those logs pushed out to your SIM so your SOC teams can look at them, whether it's an IT or an IT-OT split or an OT SOC team. So again, you're leveraging multiple protocols here. You got DCOM across the wire for that communication. It's hitting WMI to get access to your event logs. So you actually have 3 different settings here with WMI. So some of the considerations across WMI when I was setting it up. So when you're doing this, and again, I've had quite a bit of experience from an administrative perspective, so I like to do things centrally, push things out with group policies and so forth. When you do that with a group policy, you can easily set up DCOM permissions, you can set up your event log reader permissions, but you get down to WMI and it's nowhere to be found. So when you look at the permissions aspect from WMI, a lot of people, they hit this stage and they throw up their hands, and then they take their nice restricted service account, plug it into the domain admins group, and all of a sudden it works. And of course it works. You now have your service account having domain admin privileges across your environment. That didn't work for me. So through a couple different tools, and I talked about this in my paper, I was able to script this out from one place, enable restricted access to my WMI provider settings, and try to do a principal release privilege type access into that. So I would say, and I think it's a good takeaway for all of us. When we get to a place where we want to punt and do the easy thing, I think we got to be very careful in that and really look at, what is the end goal of this? Is it, we want to be more secure, we want to have endpoint visibility and so forth, but are we doing so at a risk to our systems and to a risk of security? So over 6 days, and I thought this was quite interesting. Now here I'm using the Nozomi appliance, and again, we had that running in our lab, and the appliance does an excellent job of really digging down into the protocol level. So here I could have also used Wireshark, but Wireshark doesn't have as nice filtering capabilities, and spinning up Wireshark for 6 days would be quite problematic. So anyway, other vendors out here in the hallway can do the same thing. I just had Nozomi at my hand, so great tool for this. I wrote a custom query to actually pull these out. But if you look at that, the sum of the bandwidth for 32 hosts in the environment was 17 gig of logs. And again, that's with advanced audit settings fairly high jacked up, but not all the way. So you can see how much traffic in your environment. And again, this is a lab environment. This isn't a this isn't a production environment where you have a lot of logins and those kind of things, a lot of service accounts spinning up and so forth. But what this does show is that logging alone can cause a lot of traffic in your environments. So one of the things with WMI DCOM pulling, excuse me, is that the connection counts were fairly stable with this. And when you consider that, you have essentially a polling server connecting out to your environment at a very, very high frequency and so forth. So your connection counts on between that server client and back will be fairly stable across. Now the packet size though in this is not stable, and I had to in these graphs I had to scrub out some of the host names and IP addresses and so forth, of course. But essentially the top 3 systems were my domain controllers, and of course in a domain environment, those are getting hit with most of the logins and from the service account, from computer accounts and user accounts and so forth. So they're going to have the most logs. But interestingly enough, when you look at this from a perspective of for my packet size and network utilization, so here essentially the systems with getting hit the most were actually the ones that had data in their packets able to be moved back and forth across the network. So that tells me though is that systems that, and again this was only the top 10 hosts, but systems that don't have logs to push across the network are really not being utilized well. What that means is systems in your ICS environment with no logs, they're just chewing up bandwidth as they're getting communicated to back and forth trying to get logs out of them. So next was to move over to Windows Event Forwarding. Now, Windows Event Forwarding is bleeding edge. No, not really. Windows Event Forwarding has been out since 2008 or Vista. So but what's interesting, though, is that even in IT space, not a whole lot of people have been implementing it right now. You don't, but in the last couple of years, like folks like the NSA, again, Australian Cybersecurity Center, other folks have put out some very, very good papers on using event forwarding. And we'll get into some of the details here in a minute. I would say in a domain environment, it's very easy to deploy, but take that with a grain of salt. Easy for one person is difficult for somebody else. If you're familiar with domains, group policy objects, and so forth, it's quite easy. But again, it all depends on who's doing this and so forth. But it is a little bit more challenging, though, when we look at deploying this across domains, or if you have across work groups. A lot of times in our ICS environments, we have multiple domains in your systems. So this is easy to deploy when you have a domain environment. But if you go across domains, you have to pull in certificates and so forth. One thing, what is really nice about it is you're using built-in Windows components. So your logs are being pushed across using Kerberos for authentication, and your logs are encrypted. It's kind of a nice thing to have. You can also set this up in a push or a pull configuration. So, so for, I would say 99% of the use cases, you'd want to push your logs from your endpoints out to your collector server. But you do have the option, and it is a little bit easier to deploy if you're actually pulling your logs. So essentially, you're just setting your collector server to go out, collect all these computers, and you're giving it the access permissions and so forth, and it goes out and collects those logs. But I'll show in a minute here, you probably don't want to be doing that. You can also create multiple subscriptions. So you can create a baseline subscription in your environment, or you can chop it up. You can have subscriptions for your different servers or different systems that are getting hit harder than others. And to do so, why you'd want to do that is to really tailor your logging settings. And so you may want to crank up your log settings on your terminal servers, remote access servers, and so forth, and crank down on them in some of the other ones in your environment. And you can also chain these collector servers together. So let's say in your architecture you have different domains, and so each of the domains you can have a collector server, and then you can go each collector servers can forward up to a centralized collector server, and then from that server it can forward on out to your SIM. So from a high-level setup on event forwarding, first thing you have to do is you have to enable Windows Remote Management. And this is also the same piece as PowerShell uses for remoting. So when you think about this, you're now enabling, if you will, PowerShell remoting, which is a good thing if it's locked down properly. But it does use that same functionality. So first thing you do is you have to go out and enable that WinRM and do a quick config on it. Now, that sets up WinRM with a default settings, and you will need to go lock those down with the group policy. After that, of course, you create the Windows Event Collector service on the server, and that's as simple as going on the server environment. You click on the subscriptions, pops up and says, hey, do you want to start up the service? You say yes. And then you go through a reboot cycle, and now that computer, whatever it was, is now acting as a collector. From then on out, you create a group policy object. And in that group policy object, you set up your settings to lock down Windows Remote, who has access into those into your endpoints with PowerShell remoting and so forth. And you also set up access for who the collector server is and so forth. With that, you can create the subscriptions in your collector server, and then, of course, forwarding on. So I also get asked, once in a while, where should I put my syslog server at? Because again, our two logging protocols we're normally using, or not protocols, but the log types are syslog and Windows logs. So putting a syslog server on that WEC server is also a good idea, I think. And one thing to note too is here you're getting all of your logs out of your environment, and you didn't have to go to any other vendor and get tooling for this. It's all done internally. So you now have a way of getting your logs, getting that endpoint visibility, not having to go out and purchase anything else, and just from a little bit of configuration on the Windows side. And we'll also discuss here that from the communication aspect and firewalls. So we've struggled a lot in the past with firewalls, and especially with DCOM. So DCOM, as most of you know, is also OPC DA. It's OPC class communication. So I would almost say that everyone in this room is running DCOM, DEC-RPC protocol, and those kind of things. But with this, you can really lock down your firewall rules for logging. When you look at the generic setting, which is HTTP, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, that's HTTP from the outlier of the transport protocol. But when you look at when you start to take that packet apart, that's just the frame of it. And then when you dig into it, it's actually an encrypted communication. And again, that's one port. It's one direction. It's very simple to set up the firewall rules in this environment for logging. So on the subscription settings, I get asked quite a bit, so where are these at in Windows? And very much so. So again, to set up a subscription, give me a second here. So to set up a subscription, you go to that field in Windows. You right-click on that, and you say New Subscription. And in that, you have a couple options here. And again, you can set up one subscription as a baseline subscription across your environment, or you can chop this up and again have multiple subscriptions targeted to multiple different types of systems. Now, with this, and let me go back here. From here, you have essentially three different options when you set up your subscriptions as well. You have your groups, or what computers is in the subscription is being included. You also have your events to collect, and that's a filtering area. We'll get into that a little bit more. And then your advanced settings on your subscription. So when you get into the computer groups, if you're doing a baseline subscription, you have the ability to go into your domain, select each individual computer you want, and add them in. Now, if you have a large domain, that might not be the most efficient method. But if you look at, and you can do this, and I'm showing it here, if you look at the domain computers and the domain controllers group in your environment, those two objects hold all computers in your environment. So just by selecting these two objects, and again, going back with that group policy, which told those computers in the environment which collector server to point to, I'm essentially now looking at all the computers in the environment, or they're all getting subscribed to. So with that, you now go into Select Events and on the Advanced tab. Now with Select Events, you do have the option in here to really pull down and optimize essentially the events that you are looking for in your environment. And again, I've asked people before, what logs do you want? And a common response is, well, give me all your logs. And that always doesn't work. So here's a good spot to really work with your SOC teams and come up and say, okay, what use cases are you running? And again, this helps out with that IT-OT convergence aspect of the OT side really working with the IST side and coming together on use cases and so forth. That's just an excellent first take in that. But again, from here, you can really narrow down which events you want, plug them in here to your use cases. So that's where you can have multiple different types of subscriptions for use cases. Here, what I'm doing, and again, just because of the test, I'm selecting the security log. But you could also create another subscription maybe for your hardware logs and so forth. So look at startups and those kind of things. Also here you have delivery options for the subscription. Now, you also have another field not shown, of course, but it's customized, it's grayed out. But you can, and again, all this stuff is accessed through PowerShell as well. So you can build up this with a PowerShell XML script and then dump this into your environment and set up all your subscriptions that way. But of course, from the user interface perspective, this is kind of how it goes. Now, from the delivery optimization, normal is essentially setting the subscription to a 15-minute timeout with 5 logs. So that's your threshold. If you want to go faster than that, you can go minimize latency, and that's every 30 seconds. Might not be the best for this environment. Minimize bandwidth is 6 hours, so it's kind of taking it to the other extreme. And then, of course, you see the protocol here is HTTP. That's that port 5985. Still Kerberos authentication, and it's encrypted data packet. So again, you do have a lot of settings on the advanced subscriptions and so forth. And again, you can also go to that customize field and customize out, your heartbeat interval, how often this checks in. If you wanted, maybe 15 minutes is too long, maybe you want to go 10 minutes or 60 minutes, it's up to you. But it's really how often do you want those logs to get into your environment, and from a visibility perspective. So again, setting the lab up with Windows Event Forwarding with push, essentially when you look at it, the logs just trickle in, and that's kind of what I saw. It's just each system, it's after it gets timed out, or if it fills up with logs, it just forwards its logs out. And so it's a very, very efficient method of getting your logs out. And again, looking at from the normal perspective on that subscription, that 5-log batch with the 15-minute timeout, I thought worked pretty good. And that's what I used initially in the testing here. So when I was putting both of these two logging methods together, I used absolutely default settings because I didn't want to influence the test with it. So again, when you look at the statistics over 7 days, it was quite shocking to me. So the visibility that my Nozomi appliance had with 32 hosts was 10 gig. So that's a 40% reduction in bandwidth in my environment, which is substantial. And again, further, if I would have modified my subscription down to a couple of different settings, I'm sure I could have got that a lot more. And after I did all my research as well, with event forwarding, it does allow you also to actually transmit your logs in a binary format versus an ASCII type format, if you will, and you can further compress your logs. So something to just think into as you get into this a little bit more. So again, one thing also came clear to me is that the connection count. So this is, again, these are the domain controllers in the environment, and then these are the rest of the servers. And of course, I've got workstations here. If you'd see this, they just taper off. But the connections on this were really for the top log generators in the environment. It had the highest number of connections accounts, which is about what you'd think. But here, the packet size was interesting to me as well, though. The packet size stayed fairly consistent. It was utilizing the network efficiently. And again, only the systems that had logs were pushing those out. They're utilizing the network resources. So from that, I think one of the key takeaways in this is that, we really need to look at and do a little bit of reflection on what are we doing to ourselves with our security tooling. Are we doing for the sake of security, are we hurting our plant environments? Or are we putting those systems in place that are helping out security, helping out integrity and uptime and availability and so forth? Because if we're putting systems in our environment in the name of security that are causing network disturbances, that are dropping packets, which are losing OPC communication, all those things, we've lost. We've failed from my aspect of as an asset owner who's charged with keeping our plants running 24/7. Another thing too is now, for me, and this is a big thing in my company, is looking at Windows Event Forwarding and thinking, this is really where we need to take it to the next step. And so those systems that can support it, my recommendation to you is at least look into this. Definitely, as you're having logging challenges and so forth, look into this tooling. And again, it's all Windows. Don't have to go out and buy anything else. If you would implement this in your environment, definitely would want to use push configuration. It's a little bit more on the group policy settings and those kind of things, but well worth it in the end. I would also look at modifying the subscription latency settings for your environment. Maybe you have that brand new plan out there with 10 to 40 gig backbones, who knows, and can handle just pumping everything through it, no problem. But for most of us who have legacy equipment, definitely we have to look at our network bandwidth and so forth. So, I think there's a lot to be gained in modifying a lot of the default settings. I also think we have a lot more that we can do with our, with working with our SOC teams on the SIM platforms and so forth to modify actually the logs that we need to get that visibility that we desire. And I also want to say too, from an aspect of what happens if our collector server crashes? What happens to the logs? Well, you have endpoint logs out there in all your endpoints. So your endpoints are still acting as a log buffer. And so the minute that that collector server stands back up, those endpoints will eventually reach back out to it, begin to communicate, and begin to forward logs again. So you already have a buffered log configuration, which I know is important to NERC folks and others that have to have logs. You can't have a log outage. So with that, definitely let's help each other out. This was an aspect when I looked into logging. There was some people looking into this, but not a whole lot of people knew about it. And for me, and looking at some of the aspects in my company, it was one of those areas that definitely we need to get better about. But also, I think that we as a community probably needs to do a little bit better job here as well. And also, again, just take that aspect of what you're doing out in your company. Just to conclude here. You may think it may be trivial, but it may be that thing that somebody else is really struggling with. So I'd encourage you, again, just to look at some of the things that you're working through, some of the challenges that you have, and really bring them up to the community and share with others. Because again, that small challenge that you may have just tackled could be somebody else's stumbling block, and they really need your help with. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you so much.